Hey, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on real-world strategies for optimizing data analytics costs. Here we have with us a couple folks here. We're going to do a panel-style discussion. Here we have Soumya Ghosh, who's a Senior Director of Data and Analytics at Slalom, and Brock Griffey, who's a Master Principal Solution Architect here at Dremio. My name is Jason Hughes, and I'm a Director of Product Management here at Dremio, and I'll be the host and moderator here for this discussion. So, really, why are we here today? Really, what are we going to cover here? One is that really, driving, as we all know, driving value from data for businesses is really critical to not just thrive, but even today, really even thrive, even to survive. But oftentimes, costs can really run, that's a great goal, but when trying to achieve that goal, right, costs can run sky high. It's super easy, I'm sure, as we've all seen, especially in the cloud, to all of a sudden get a huge bill of something you didn't even mean to do, let alone when you have a large organization trying to do the same thing. And especially in today's market, today's world, it's more important than ever to really minimize that cost, really improve that ROI on getting that value, but also mitigating the actual cost to really improve and maximize that ROI. And that's where this discussion comes in, is we're going to talk about real world strategies based on, the experience that we and, certainly the two panelists have had around how do you actually optimize your data analytics costs, right? How do you maximize that ROI to make sure that you're getting the benefit, but also mitigating that cost as much as possible. So some of the topics that we'll talk about is really how the pressure to be really product led in terms of, data products and really those kind of SLAs and such around data. Really affects the balance between centralized and decentralized control and what that means for how do you mitigate and control costs in that kind of world. In the same kind of way, how do you manage chargeback in a world that's more decentralized, right? There's more decentralized ownership and kind of data mesh-like environment. And what does it mean when, how does it actually manifest itself when there's, misalignment between the cost control objectives, which is the actual, top-down kind of goals that you have, versus the actual organizational structure that's in charge of actually implementing and actually achieving those goals, as well as the relationship between, cost controls and vendor lock-in, right? Like that's a very common, vendors are all over, and it's always something you have to work with. How do you actually mitigate that, and how do you best land in that relationship in terms of that cost control versus the vendor lock-in, and where do you sit in there? So with that, we'll go ahead and start the panel here. So really to kick us off here, Soumya, we'll start with you. Gartner really talks about the evolution of cost management being really from this cost cutting to then more of this cost optimization to really then more of that value optimization. How do you feel about that kind of characterization? Like, where do you think companies are really in their state of maturity in that context?
I think, thank you, Jason, for inviting me in this panel. Hey, everyone. I feel like it's a very appropriate characterization based on, our implementation experience with our customers helping in their cloud journey. So really most of the cases, it starts with cost cutting, right? So you are, as a client, you are managing a huge on-prem centric like data centers that you are managing, and starting your cloud journey with an aim towards cost cutting, right? And it is driven by a lot of the times a lift and shift kind of mindset. Like the goal is to get quick wins, retiring, getting out of the data center operations, and essentially IaaS, infrastructure as a service kind of migration to the cloud. And this process can, take up to 6 months to a year, depending upon, how big of an organization the client represents. And then fast forward, let's say 6 to 8 months into their adoption journey, they come to realization that their monthly bills, cloud bills are growing, right? And there's a lot of inefficiency, and they're not making the most efficient use of the cloud resources. And regarding this context, like I want to just mention a quick independent study that resulted in 30% or more of the cloud spend is either inefficient or wasted, right? So this creates an opportunity, if you think about it, and for clients to kind of look for modernizing from their archaic on-prem based architecture, which are primarily like infrastructure as a service, like VM hosted solution, from that type of solution architecture to large scale refactoring, right? Towards more modern architecture, both for applications and data platforms, right? Adoption of containers, serverless design patterns, microservices, adoption of platform as a services, service offerings that cloud platform providers provide. So this leads to cost optimization, right? Performance improvement, productivity, and efficiency gains. And this phase can take up to 1 or 2 years, again, depending upon the size and scale of operations of a customer. On an average, by the end of year, let's say 2 or 3, right? Companies are also in the process of digital transformation. Most of the companies are in the process of already embarked on a digital transformation journey, or they're about to start their journey, right? So the need for like new generation data-driven digital products, application development, that need grows where tech organization or traditional IT organization are made to partner more closely with business to drive business outcome, adopt strategies to more ROI from a tech spend and business value realization perspective to accelerate the transformation journey of the organization. With this success criteria for IT and tech orgs are measured more in terms of value delivery rather than the older metrics like adoption, cost and efficiency gain related wins, etc. So this whole transformation journey drives IT to adopt a digital product-centric strategy where cloud becomes an enabler to deliver faster value. I feel like that's kind of the cloud optimization phase that most of the companies kind of mature in that, if you follow that Gartner's classification.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes total sense. For the next question, we'll actually stick with you, Soumya, as well, because I know you're passionate about this one too. Really, many organizations really have adopted, cost optimization frameworks. But often those frameworks struggle to really start producing savings, right? So what's been your experience with this, and why does it struggle to really start producing savings?
Sure, I will definitely get to that, Jason. But before that, I just wanted to share a few interesting statistics, tidbits that are very, very contextual, right? So as we talk about adoption and cloud journey, 6 out of 10 businesses, they're in the process of either already moving their workloads to cloud or actively planning to move their workloads to cloud. 69% of the companies, and this is all based on independent study, 69% of the companies have accelerated their cloud migration over the past 12 months. Obviously, due to pandemic, which led to a lot of digital transformation being more data driven, all of that have accelerated this path, right? Talking about cost, just a very interesting statistics. By end of 2022, the overall worldwide, the overall cloud spend is forecasted to be close to $482 billion. And by end of 2025, that forecast is going to touch $1 trillion. So we are talking about massive growth in cloud spend. So now coming back to your question about cost optimization, obviously it's extremely important. We are talking about huge amount of spend and investment from companies of all size and scale perspective, right? I feel like the term like cloud financial management, it's more than the well-architected framework, right? It is a holistic discipline leading organizations through cloud financial maturity and success. There is a learning curve that companies are going through, as Gartner also kind of categorized in that 3-tier category, right? So in a way, like DevOps kind of revolutionized the end-to-end product delivery, there is a need for adoption to a cloud FinOps, right? That is going to change how organizations manage their cloud spend, right? Some of the key challenges, a key challenge that organizations faced is wasted cloud spend due to their financial operating models remaining. It's like a jumble of legacy processes, legacy mindset, and methodologies and technologies that they use, right? So again, few interesting tidbits here. 13% of the organizations on an average exceed their public cloud spend budget, right? 80% of the CIOs admit that they have yet to achieve their targeted value from cloud adoption, right? So these are really interesting kind of statistics. Now, coming back to the pain points that you were asking, like why these optimization frameworks are not being successful. I think moving and expanding footprints in cloud obviously is presenting organizations with a host of multifaceted challenges, right? And in most cases, what we found in coming from consulting space is that customers are not very well positioned to solve these problems on their own. I have seen challenges like there is no visibility and predictability. You're in the cloud, you're operating in the cloud, you're getting a monthly bill. But in terms of visibility and predictability of that spend, most of the companies still struggle, right? In terms of accountability and cultural change, the ways of working change when you operate in the cloud, like how to drive accountability for cloud spend around the edges of your organization, right? How to create the visibility for stakeholders regarding our application owners, how their applications are driving cloud cost. This is a massive challenge. Then best practices and priorities, it's sometimes unclear, right? Like best practices around tools and technologies and processes, which products or applications should be prioritized for modernization to drive the cost down, maximize the ROIs. A lot of customers are struggling to find the answers to this. Then confused cloud pricing, right? Having a knowledge, depending upon which public cloud provider you're using, maximizing the provider discount opportunities. Is the environment and services configured cost effectively? Those are some of the things that it requires knowledge, it requires deep dive into that specific vendor's offering. And then lack of financial governance, right? Like how do I empower my teams to make informed, cost-effective cloud architecture and design decisions? How do I implement like cloud financial governance and controls with the existing team that organizations have? Those are some of the, I would say, like major pain areas that I have observed and my colleagues in Slalom when we work with our customers.
Yeah, something just to kind of piggyback on that. You mentioned about the people not utilizing the ability to get discounts. And I see that every time I talk to a prospect or a customer. They're always amazed whenever I go in and say, hey, if you're looking at EC2 instances and the cost of them, if you sign up for a 1-year deal, because most of the time you're not going to just do, hey, I want to do a month deal or something like that. You're going to do like a 1-year deal or a 3-year deal. There's a significant amount of savings, 30%, 60% if you do that. And that pays for itself over time. So when you look at these things, don't just go in thinking, well, I'm going to do, a couple months and try it out. You can, but after that, don't let it stay that way. Don't do a pay-as-you-go model. You're going to lose out on these significant savings you can get from your vendors. I mean, every vendor is going to do it, whether it be cloud vendors or even your software vendors. They're going to give you those kinds of discounts that are just going to add up over time. And that's how we can significantly reduce this. So as we look throughout this whole process, that's something everyone should be looking at.
Yeah, definitely good points all around. So Brock, let's stay with you here. Really, as I mentioned before, really around the misalignment between, the kind of cost objectives and the organizational structure, like who is really responsible for the cloud cost generation, the actual consumption and generation of the cost versus the budget versus the actual optimization, right? What's your view of the kind of cloud ops, if you want to call it that, kind of function, and really how does ownership of, the cloud cost savings impact the actual savings produced by, the actual cost savings initiatives?
Yeah, good question. So in terms of, who's responsible for generating costs, it's obviously going to be the data producers and the data consumers are the ones that they're generating the bulk of the cost on the cloud. You have people that are going to be spending money on compute just to produce the data and produce, anything within the environment, something for consumption. Ultimately, at the end of the day, someone's going to be consuming some kind of information. That's where all the cost is going to be lying around. And a lot of times the cloud ops people aren't responsible for those costs, but it's put on their back to control and put mechanisms in place on how do we actually budget and constrain who is doing what. And that's where people really need to start using things like, within the environments that they have today, tagging and optimization around tagging, looking at whenever you're using resources, who is actually the user of those resources, and getting more granular on how you do, how do we provision out resources to individuals, whether it be through different VPCs or different accounts, to make sure those accounts, you can keep track of the spend within those accounts. And then, of course, getting more granular with, tagging and putting chargeback models in place. So that way your financial structure can go back and look at who was doing what and why were we charging X amount of money. And obviously, if you do that, you can find anything that's rogue, something that's not tagged, something that doesn't have information on it, and go back and find out who is responsible for doing that. And obviously, all this, you have to have some tracking mechanism. And all of this ultimately is going to help you optimize your budget. For responsibilities and who's actually responsible, I think, Somia, you had some insight into like the actual people who should be responsible for different parts of this. I think a lot of it for the actual mechanism and setup and configuration is going to be more of that cloud ops function. But I think you can talk more about from a financial perspective, who should be responsible for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this goes back to the overall cloud financial management, right? And it's beyond just cloud ops, right? If you think about it. So cloud financial management, it's the practice of bringing together finance, technology, and business to master the unit of economics of cloud operations, right? And it would include a proper, going back to your question of who should be responsible for what, it requires, from an operating model perspective, it requires a financial operating model that is purpose-built for the cloud operations. It requires a way of kind of introducing the accountability and visibility for cloud spend, a cultural practice, ways of working change, so to say, for newer organization adopting cloud that delivers the financial and operational control. From an ops structure or operating model structure perspective, it's a cross-functional group of people from finance, technology, operations, all coming together and creating this cloud FinOps as an organization. And most of the large clients that we have worked with, this type of cloud FinOps actually roll into the CXOs of the organization, right, of the company. And it's really, typically it is led by a head of cloud FinOps, whose job is really to drive the alignment across executive leadership, establish vision, strategy, and communications for the FinOps culture, right? And then support and partner with business units to support their major cloud initiatives. Then there should be a cloud FinOps kind of manager who is responsible for basically governing the FinOps structure, track the metrics that should be regularly monitored, and maintain the reporting dashboard, create and send the cloud FinOps communications. It's almost like a newsletter, right? Every week or a monthly basis, there should be communication to entire company or the major stakeholders, and that creates kind of visibility across operations, right? And then really the feet on the ground, if you think about it, there are 4 major personas, right? It's the cloud financial analyst who builds the business case, cloud business case. They partner with a business unit who are trying to adopt cloud, and then metric calculation, financial analysis frameworks, putting those in place, and then basically coming up with a forecast and budget for the cloud spend, right? At a different corners of the company, at a BU level or a line of business level, etc. And then if you look at from the optimization perspective, there is a persona of cloud cost optimization lead, and this persona is responsible for engaging with the engineering and architecture organizations to build a cost-aware architectural blueprint. And the whole purpose is this FinOps kind of act as a center of excellence, right? As a cloud center of excellence. So any new application team that is coming to get onboarded, what kind of architectural blueprint they should be follow from a cost optimization perspective, it's the responsibility for this persona. And then more from a DevOps engineering perspective, like you talked about tagging and labeling the cloud resources, that's something as part of this cloud FinOps organization, a DevOps engineer is responsible for integrating the labeling, tagging appliances and tooling into the cloud resource management, right? And set up the the alerts and the runbooks for key stakeholders based on the budgetary thresholds that they have. And then the monitoring part is so important. There has to be a data analytics engineer, a more of an analytics engineer persona, whose job is to kind of enhance the cost visibility, collect metrics, prepare dashboards, and using various types of advanced analytics, AI, ML, data analytics techniques, right? And so these are like different personas and the responsibility of their individual roles in the overall cloud ops or cloud FinOps kind of construct.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And that's definitely a lot of helpful color. So we'll stick with you to kick this one off too, Soumya. When we're really talking about, you know, all of the things that you both just talked about and how difficult that can be, even in a centralized world. Now, if we look at, you know, really with data mesh, or at least data mesh principles, right, starting to take more and more hold, you know, really talk about chargeback in that kind of world, that gets even more difficult, right? In these kind of controls, right? Like, the more useful your data product is, well, that consumption is actually going against your bottom line, right? Like in the previous model, but that punishes people for actually creating valuable things, right? So really, when you look at it that way, and it's always kind of this evolution, right? Nothing in, especially in business and analytics, is ever overnight. Like, how important is getting that, or how do you think about getting that right chargeback model and that evolution into, as you adopt more and more of these decentralized data mesh kind of principles, and really, how do you make sure that it's not, you know, it's really more of a helper rather than an obstacle, right? Really getting that implementation and making sure that again, if you get that chargeback model right, and how you evolve it, that it doesn't punish people for actually creating valuable things that others get value from?
That is a great question, Jason, and I'll try to answer. As a technologist, like I feel this is where like data platform technologies where storage and compute are truly separated play an ideal role to help organizations implement data mesh. And I'll tell you why. Because these technologies, and there are quite a few now in the marketplace, these technologies really allow data product owners to own the cost associated, if you think about it, the storage of their data product, the compute associated with creation, maintenance, and sustenance of these data products, right? But any consumer of data products, like you mentioned, like if somebody creates a popular data product, which is there are lots of consumers and people who are getting benefited by data product. I feel like if the architecture can be built in such a way that any consumer of data products may need to bring in a variety of their own compute engines, right? Supported by a more open kind of architecture, like open source, more open source architecture, more open compute engines. And that way, the data product consumers are kind of held responsible or accountable for their consumption cost, right? Related to the compute, as opposed to the data product owners being responsible, or in your words, like being punished for such compute cost that is resulted from such consumption, right? So I feel like if we can come up with architecture leveraging this type of technologies where compute and storage is clearly separated, adoption of those technologies can really bring in that separation of accountability, right? And if you look at in the marketplace, there are quite a few data sharing technologies, right, that also support this type of publisher subscriber type of architecture in a data mesh centric design. So I feel like choosing the right kind of technology solution, right kind of technology mindset and principles, it will enable and not punish the data product owners for creating actually popular products in a data mesh centric, kind of construct.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's really, the open architecture gives you that capability, having the ability to separate this compute and storage, and then the data producers from the consumers. So that way the producers can maintain and manage the actual data pipeline, make sure that it's doing what it needs to do. But then the consumers have their own compute to be able to, the proper chargeback. I'm going to utilize my resources. I'm going to pay for my resources to do whatever I need to do with this data. And at the end of the day, you're not punishing them, the producers. The producers are free to do what they need to do. They, of course, can look and see what's the most useful data that I'm producing. And do I need to make more of this? Do I need to enhance this? And rather than being punished, you're actually going to make it better for everyone in the long run. And obviously that pub sub kind of, ability is definitely very beneficial, because now I can share to not only within my organization, maybe outside my organization to other users. And then obviously bringing the best tool for the job. With an open architecture, I'm free to use whatever tool can read the data. It doesn't matter if it's, one data warehouse or one external application that can read that data. I have those capabilities because it's an open architecture. It really helps out with how we can actually work with the data, make more use out of the data, and not punish those who are building and making that information available to others.
And another thought that I have personally experienced working with a multinational, very large, CPG manufacturing company. So what we ended up doing is, I think one of the themes of this webinar, Jason, as you mentioned at the very outset, is that digital transformation is kind of driving towards a digital product building mentality, right? And when you kind of define your data and analytics or strategy organization in the form of digital products, I feel from a chargeback and infrastructure design perspective, what I have seen in place or helped this client put in place is more of a hub and spoke kind of infrastructure pattern, right? So it's like, there are always core foundational data assets that a company will always have, right? And maybe the infrastructure needed for building such data foundation may lie with a centralized organization. So they will be held accountable for, kind of defining this data foundation, setting up this data foundation, and be responsible for the compute and storage cost associated in maintaining this data foundation infrastructure. But then there are spoke organizations, which are maybe there may be different digital product centric organizations who are trying to tap into this data foundation, and they're going to mold those foundational data elements to create new data products that they need. So any sort of storage, compute, pipeline, infrastructure needs that these spoke organizations would come and consume from the hub, they should be held accountable for that cost, right? So that way, if you establish a chargeback model with the proper tagging, labeling strategy, proper kind of resource group, subscription kind of structure, I think it is possible to accomplish this objective in a database centric world.
Yeah, definitely a good point. I think that's something that doesn't get talked about nearly as much when we talk about, the principles of data mesh and everything. Like decentralized ownership, but centralized, kind of infrastructure providing, but also the centralization of that kind of at a minimum, the framework of how do you manage cost? How do you do that chargeback? So everyone isn't inventing their own thing, especially for something as important as managing the cost of your cloud spend, right? So I think it's definitely a good point. So Sumi, something you mentioned before was around the actual, some of the technologies that can actually help you. And if you actually implement or adopt some of these technologies that can actually help you. So, Brock, when we moved to this kind of decentralized or at least decentralized ownership and kind of this data product, and really you're consuming it from others, and really kind of this data product as a service, if you will. How do these kind of technologies and service providers, such as Dremio, who's obviously you have most experience with, how do they kind of help with that kind of data product as a service and as it relates to cost optimization as well?
Yeah, I think what Sumi had just said actually plays perfectly into what tools like Dremio can actually provide. You have that central location for where your data is and the catalog essentially of all that information, all that data. So as you build that out, you then provide it for users and then build their own additional enhancements on top of that data. So I want to build up my own digital transformation of that data, and I want to utilize something that someone else has already built. In Dremio, we have that central capability of doing that. So you can go into Dremio, build out those other data products for your consumers, for your organization on top of the central catalog. From there, in terms of, I have all my governance and security and everything else built into the product. I also have the ability to provision out and the compute. And it's all from a central platform rather than being from, many different platforms trying to figure out who is doing what where. You can actually use Dremio's centralized platform as well, from the aspect of, setting up engines and tags and setting up separate compute for those users to actually run queries against the data, do analytics on top of the data, and do data exploration and maybe some actually doing reporting on top of that as well. That is something that, from the Dremio standpoint, we have those capabilities. And then you have effectively created a model that you can see from end to end who is producing the data, who is consuming the data, who should we charge back for those data points and what they're using. And that way, at the end of the day, you've created a data mesh architecture that you're providing the data to the users as they need it, and just creating an easy way for them to consume and be data consumers all around.
Yeah, definitely some good points there. So on that kind of note, as we're talking about now, a little bit talking about vendors here, Suma, what have you seen with regards to the relationship, between these cost controls that we've been talking about and vendor lock-in? have you seen any approaches that, work better than others? There's no silver bullet, but, in your experience, what have you seen work well?
That's a great question again, Jason. So I feel, yes, I mean, vendor lock-in and cost optimization, there are definitely some overlaps, and I wish there would have been a silver bullet to solve that problem. But the reality is that there is no silver bullet, but there are certain foundational principles that, if adopted, I think it puts the customers in a better position from a vendor lock-in or cost optimization perspective. To give you some to drive a little bit deeper into this topic, um, you know, keeping portability in mind when defining architectural decisions or take choices is key to avoid vendor lock-in, right? And since today we are talking primarily about data and analytics platform, um, one way of adopting this portable design, in my opinion, is adoption of more open data platform architecture. And I completely support what Brock was just saying, because if you adopt more open data platform architecture with plug and play type compute and distributed query engines, I think Dremio kind of perfectly fits into that persona of a technology, right? It's distributed compute, distributed query engine with its separate compute that you can bring close to the data or put it overlay on top of open data platform that it can interact with, and end users gets the flexibility in all the use cases that Brock was just talking about. From a storage perspective of this open data platform architecture, in my opinion, there are certain fundamental decisions that someone has to make, right? So, for example, if you're going with one of the major cloud providers, the object storage service, which is the mass scale, highly scalable, highly performant storage service that most of the public cloud providers, you have to kind of use that as a foundation, right, of your data lake or of your data platform, the core of it, right? So you can, from a storage perspective of that data in one of these object storage services, I think customers, I'm seeing that trend, and as a technologist and strategist, I always advise my customers to adopt one of the open table storage formats, like the Delta, the Iceberg, Apache Hoodies. These are three very popular open source storage formats, table formats, 100% NC-SQL compliant kind of format. I think that is key towards kind of creating the foundational storage area of your data platform, right? Instead of using a vendor native storage format, because if you use a vendor native storage format, maybe there are some efficiencies that you gain, but then you are getting locked in with that vendor, right? And then on top of such open data lake, architecture, bringing the distributed SQL or Python engine, Python compatible query engines for that matter, to consume and query such data lakes in a variety of use cases, like Brock was mentioning, BI, like ad hoc querying capability, ML model training and serving layer. All of those capabilities or consumption capabilities can be met with such open platform architecture and the distributed query engine to work in between. So such query engines, it should have like scalable compute engines supported by Kubernetes based containerized architecture, appropriate data caching features to support performance, auto scaling in a lakehouse architecture, avoiding like ton of movement of data and costly ETL job implementation and then maintenance of those jobs, in a very fault tolerant way, right? And sometimes it's not necessary to move the data from point A to point B with this type of query engines kind of overlaying on top of the open platform architecture. This allows the architecture to be flexible. It allows less vendor lock-in from a data warehouse vendor technology perspective. And such layers can be easily replaced, actually, because look, we live in a world where technologies are changing every few years, right? And more shiny new toys are going to continue to come in the technology space. So if you have this type of architecture, so that middle query engine layer, it can be relatively easily replaced with more modern, more up-to-date, as the tech landscape kind of evolves, without having to rebuild or migrate your entire data storage layer. So that's I always kind of solicit this kind of advice if a customer is coming to me and kind of doing things from scratch, what sort of strategies they should adopt. I just want to mention, I think it is contextual in this for this very topic, that adoption of multi-cloud and hybrid cloud strategy may also help to some extent, because it goes back to the what vendor you're going to choose to build your foundational storage, right? So that's where I have seen some of the large organizations are adopting multi-cloud also. There are some of the players in even AI ML market space where they are actually also building multi-cloud supporting technology that would allow you to train a model reading data from multiple cloud platform within the context of the enterprise. So the technology is evolving at a pretty fast pace. There are ways of, as long as these fundamental principles are followed, I think companies can be safe from vendor locking and accomplish cost efficiency gains.
Yeah, I think the heart of it is with vendor lock-in, you're stuck using the tools, and the tools only available from that vendor or from the partners that vendor works with. With an open source type stack, you have the ability to pick what's the best storage, what's the best format for my data, or table format, whether it be Iceberg, Delta, Hoodie, whatever it is, and then on top of that, what is the best engine? How am I going to interact with the data, right? If I'm doing a long haul ETL job, maybe I'm using Spark to do some of that. If I'm doing queries and analytics on top of that, maybe I'm using Dremio for that, because it just makes sense. And if I'm having that architecture where you can scale out, right, and scale down, that's super important to be able to spin up more resources and spin down the resources as needed. And then of course, at the end of the day, no one has one tool to consume the data, so that the tools to consume the data need to be able to work with this open framework as well. So whether it's Dremio or again maybe some Spark type tools or whatever, maybe you're using Python, you need to be able to interact with the data as well. So having that open stack makes it a lot easier. It also makes it so, like you said, shiny new toy comes in, I want to use that, because that seems, one, I want to test it out, see how good it is. Maybe it replaces some of my tools for my use cases. Maybe it's more efficient. Maybe it's just cheaper. And you have those options. If you're with a vendor that locks you into their own platform, you don't have those options. It's only if the vendor comes up with something new. And I don't know about you guys, but I think most vendors aren't going to release something cheaper unless they have a competitor that's doing something against them. So once you're locked in, you're in. And I do think that, sticking with that stack, you're just going to have a lot more flexibility all around.
Yeah, definitely good points. And yeah, Rob, to your point around incentives generally rule the world. So I think the probably the last question that we have time for here is, Brock, we'll start with you, and then Sumi, if you want to follow up your thoughts here, is really how can organizations really think about cost savings, right, as part of really the technology selection process, whether it's the shiny new toy or whatever it may be, or subsequently the project delivery, really the process of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much everything we talked about here today. There's the whole structure from the beginning to the end. You need to think about, what is my architecture going to look like at the end? What am I trying to accomplish? So starting from that, trying to accomplish, and technically starting from the end, what do I need to do to get there? Looking at these open source technologies and see if they fit into your platform to give you as much flexibility as you need throughout the process. And then figuring out what tools have the capabilities to put those cost-cutting measures in place. How do I tag them? How do I make sure that I'm getting the proper chargeback model so that my group isn't the one producing all the data and getting charged for everything? So making sure you have those mechanisms in place, everything we talked about again, that's all going to link back up to how do we put everything in place to be successful for not just today, but for tomorrow and 3 years and 5 years from now. I think that's whole process is just, again, starting at the end, what is my end goal? And then working back from there.
I agree with Brock. I think if I think about it, again, coming from a consulting kind of mindset and doing, solution and project delivery, I think at the very inception of a project or program, you kind of have to understand the true needs, functional use cases, business use cases of the solution that you're going to deliver, right? And what are the, how many times it has happened, I have walked into a new project or client team, and I heard that we absolutely need near real-time or real-time data. Sometimes what clients fail to realize is there is a cost associated with bringing the data real time, right? Even with the most efficient of architecture and most cost-saving choices of technology that we're going to have, there is still a high cost associated with such implementing such ingestion patterns, right? So really evaluating like what you are trying to accomplish with this data. Do you really need those more costly patterns to get implemented in the cloud, or your needs are, you can wait for a few hours for that data to come in without causing any havoc in your downstream operations? So those sort of considerations, understanding the true need, and coming up with an architectural pattern and choice of technology, cloud native services that fits those business use cases. I think that's where I have seen like a lot of pitfalls can be actually addressed from a cost overall spend perspective. And also it impacts the delivery timeline of a project. More costly patterns that you're going to adopt, maybe implementation of those patterns is going to, so that goes back to the delivery part, the timeline of the delivery, how fast value can be delivered to the business. All of that kind of has a role to play in these
TCO.
conversations.
Yeah, it's TCO. I mean, if you think about it, it's not the cost, the dollar value, it's the people cost, the time cost, then the dollar value. Like time is money. So anytime you spend to do something, whether it be, hey, this is gonna make it really efficient in the long run, but the time to do this outweighs it. And by the time we implement it, we're on to something newer. You gotta think about that too, right? If that's gonna be such a long process, it's maybe not worth it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, thanks a lot, guys, for sharing all that information and experience and knowledge. Well, I've been monopolizing the questions here. So why don't we go to the audience and answer some of their questions. Cool. So it looks like we have one question here from an audience member, from Hari. He asked, how do you budget in the cloud? Should this come from, really more product owners or really more of an enterprise, or where does that budget kind of split go? Sum, you want to start with you? You want to go ahead and give your thoughts, and then Brock, if you want to follow up with anything.
Yeah, sure. I can. Thank you for that question, Hari. So I think it's a collaborative process, right? So if you heard some of the topics that we just discussed, one way I have seen this being done very efficiently is products. In order for a product owner to implement their product, manage their product, manage the life cycle of their product, they're going to need cloud resources. It could be storage, it could be compute, or it could be various other types of cloud native services, right? And the foundation, typically in large enterprises, the data or application foundation architecture is owned by the enterprise, like a central team, be it IT or a central infrastructure group, right? So the growth of that foundation in terms of acquisition of new data sources, depending upon the need of the products, the new products or evolution of existing products, enterprise team is responsible for managing that core foundational infrastructure. So any cost associated with maintaining and sustaining that central cloud foundation, data and application foundation infrastructure is typically budgeted by the enterprise team. But they need to collaborate with product teams to understand the evolution of business needs, right? Similarly, on the product side, the product owner is responsible for managing the product feature roadmap, right? And what all additional resources that the product would need in order to implement that roadmap in due course of time. So the product owner would, like the hub and spoke infrastructure that I was just referring to, if the architecture pattern is implemented that way, then the product owner should be able to estimate, what sort of cloud spend they would have from a bespoke organization perspective, right, for that specific product. Each of these product owners would be responsible for submitting their own cost estimate for the evolution of their product, and they would provide or feed inputs to the enterprise team for those foundational resources that they need in order for to support the evolution of that product. So it's a collaborative process between enterprise and product teams. And then all the cost, I was talking about that cloud FinOps structure earlier, it all rolls under that cloud FinOps organization, and the different personas that I talked about, they help both the enterprise as well as the product owners to be more efficient in this whole estimation process.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to budgeting, it's always hard. It's a question I get all the time whenever I'm working with a customer. Hey, what's the total cost of this? And it's not just an easy thing to estimate what the total cost could be. And I always encourage people, like, let's do a small, test. What is this going to cost you to run this? Let's get some samples of your information, your data, and see what this is really going to cost you. At least from the vendor perspective, we can give you an idea of, hey, it should be X amount because your workload is this, and this is what we're seeing throughout a testing that we did with you. And that's, one part of it. And then obviously feeding that information into your enterprise group to understand, all right, how much are we going to be paying to get this, product, whatever it is, into our catalog that we can actually use and utilize. So, I mean, back to what you said, it is a culmination of working with multiple groups, and sometimes it's work with the vendor also to understand what is it going to cost from the vendor perspective, and helping understand that, your data consumption, what your patterns are going to be. And then as you grow, obviously things are going to change, but that's the base of it. Let's figure out what the baseline is and how can we grow from there.
Yeah, I think both of you made some good points there for sure. Just so everyone else, we have another question here, but just to reiterate, if you do have, the audience has any other questions, feel free to type it in the Q&A box. We'll be sure to address them. We have another question here from Zohab asking, one of the aspects you did touch about was various personas in the cloud financial governance framework. Where would you recognize these personas? Would these be people from the business or more of the centralized information services? And how would you help transform or add to some of these capabilities of these people to recognize these additional responsibilities? So more of a kind of skills and people question.
Yeah, sure. I can try to address that. It's a great question, by the way. And a lot of companies are actually struggling to actually set up such an organizational unit. In my opinion, the personas that I talked about, it's a cross-functional team. We have people, typically what I have seen or advocated for is building an empowered, centralized, cross-functional FinOps team, where there is a representation from business, there is a representation from finance, and representation from enterprise technology teams that basically fill in these personas. And they have very specific roles and responsibility and activities that they are going to support in order to make the right decisions, provide right kind of guidance. From a so if you think about it, there are different aspects of these skills, right? So one aspect is creating transparency and communication across the enterprise, right? So when I was talking about that cloud FinOps manager persona and the head of cloud FinOps persona, this entire organization unit should be separated from any sort of bureaucracy, right? Because typically in large enterprises, there is a lot of political red tape bureaucracy that is involved. So this should be an enabled, empowered organization rolling into the C-level, probably head of operations like chief operating officer or chief finance officer kind of construct, right? And these people would be responsible for, from an empowerment, open communication, transparency perspective, advocating for cloud adoption perspective. The head of cloud FinOps and manager, they are responsible for publishing newsletters and making sure that the transparency is there. Then on the more boots on the ground personas, if you think about it, providing architectural footprints to guide appropriate tool and cloud native service adoption into the product architecture, right? Establishing those architectural blueprints is extremely important from any new product team that is getting onboarded into this infrastructure, what sort of technology patterns they should follow to become more cost efficient. That's a very important part. Supporting the operational part of it, tagging up the right resources. So I talked about a DevOps persona. So somebody from the engineering team is part of this FinOps group whose job, and it could be one or multiple people under the persona, depending upon the size and scale of the operation. So this persona is responsible really ensuring there is proper tagging of resources in this shared architecture pattern mode, right? To make sure the chargeback is appropriately set up and which product group is consuming which particular Kubernetes cluster, just to give you an example. And there has to be proper tagging and tracking. And then the analyst persona really, if you think about it, it's an analytics engineer, and whose job is to make sure, the logging and all the other, detail resources where consumption can be calculated and monitored, making sure there is an analytical layer to keep an eye on the consumption, setting up alerts where consumption, goes high. There is an alert raised, or there is some disruption that would get caused because of that, and the head of that product group would be notified. So setting up all these core infrastructural premises is with the responsible for the analytics engineering group under this FinOps structure. So it's evolving. Obviously, different companies are at different stages, and most of the companies who are in the cloud kind of this modernization path or migration path, they're figuring out to cross-skill and upskill their existing team and reorganize a little bit to kind of define this operating model and become more efficient. So there could be some initial hiccups with the skill challenges, but I think that's where, we at Slalom, we help, not just from a cloud technology perspective, but also from an organizational design perspective. We help our customers at various scale to accomplish this type of organizational structure.
Yeah, one of the things I just want to kind of go back to is, adopting some kind of framework to help you work through this will really help you out in terms of a framework of, hey, here's the steps we should do and how we should follow different things to do the tagging, do different steps, and then put the responsibilities on those who should be doing that. And it doesn't need to be, I think one of the questions, like talking about convincing a ton of people to do this, but I think it can be, one small group or one person who's in charge of the infrastructure to set up the baseline and make sure people are following that, and just training individuals on, hey, when you spin up a resource, it needs to be tagged with this. And a lot of tools will automatically do that. Like Dremio, when you set up an engine in Dremio, it will keep the tag, and anytime it starts and stops, it'll have that tag. Anytime someone uses it, it'll use the tag based on, the user coming in. So those kinds of things can be set up once and then be forgotten about. And then when it comes time for reporting, that can be fed into your AWS reports, to your Azure reports, whatever it may be. You're going to get those reports coming back out, and it will have the information in there. You don't need to train a massive amount of people on this. It's more like, let's put a framework in place. Let's make sure we educate the users, and any new things that need to happen, we need to actually follow through with that pattern, and just have some checks and balances. It doesn't need to be super complicated. As the organization grows and more teams grow, it can get complicated. But even when you start off small, you don't need to make it complicated. So I don't think it's hey, we have to have a team of 50 people to do this. It can start off small and grow as we grow.
Yeah, for sure. And Brock, yeah, you kind of touched on for the rest of the audience. Yeah, we had some feedback / kind of question come in saying, whoa, you're talking about what size of a group needing to adopt a new technology. Huge ask to convince 10 plus people. So I think, Brock, you definitely touched on the kind of skills and organizational aspect for sure there. So do you want to talk about kind of what it takes to the keyword convince, a large group of people, and what you've seen work well there, whether you're on the centralized team or, the central team or the product team?
Yeah,
both ways. Sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. I think I want to make sure that everything that we discussed, it is kind of kept in the context of organization of various size and scale, right? So as Brock mentioned, like, things can really get hairy as the teams grow, organizations grow, more products are getting implemented, and more people are involved in this ecosystem, right? That's where you need structure. If you don't have that structure, it can go out of hand, which all the large enterprises try to avoid. But for small and medium scale organizations, startups for that matter, like, the construct is still applicable, but the personas and the size of such one person may multiple hats, right? Which we all do in our job in one way or the other. So to Brock's point, like, these foundational principles and guardrails need to be established. Is it one person playing multiple persona to support a 10 people plus organization, or is it 100,000 people organization being supported by a central cloud FinOps group? That's the different question of scale. I would suggest, like, for a new technology, right? If you're trying to adopt a new technology, it's advisable to start small, right? So you have a separate, kind of sandbox kind of area, sandbox kind of resource group, and a subscription, which is kind of treated as a playground to give you that gives you the ability to play around with the tool and technology and understand the nuances, understand the spend pattern, understand the compute and storage consumption pattern, and that will help you kind of estimate, right? You can do this testing in a sandbox, look at the pattern, look at the size and scale, have some approximation, right? When this type of technology is actually put in production, approximately how many users are concurrently going to use those patterns or these new solutions or products. That would give you some idea about the cost estimation process for any new tech or tool adoption perspective. So I have typically advised and seen this type of ways of working in place when we try to. So it's not so much about convincing. I mean, you have to convince the user. Yes, cost is a big deal, right? Depending upon your overall picture, but obviously it's a functionality and the use cases that new tool or technology is serving. That if you can convince that, I think the cost part can be managed with proper guidelines and best practices.
Yeah, and you know, when it comes to new technologies, obviously, it's a much larger ask to say, hey, enterprise-wide adoption versus let's start off small use case, and then we'll grow from there. I've seen it both ways. I've seen many of my customers have started off, hey, we want to just do an enterprise adoption. Just be prepared that this is going to be a long process because it's not necessarily convincing. It's, hey, we need to go through steps of all the functionality requirements, different use cases for each and every group. And does it fit this? Does it checkmark every box? Do we have a competitor? Does a competitor checkmark every box? It starts getting complicated fast and does take a long time. Now, in terms of, let's start with a small use case and make sure it works for what we want. Maybe for this one group, they need it. So starting small and growing is a lot easier to do than it is to just land a giant, enterprise-wide tool. And that slowly grows. We see that, most people enjoy going through that process more so than, hey, I need something today, but it's going to take us a year to get it because we need to go through the enterprise adoption method. So it just kind of depends on where you're at in an organization, how you do that. And then, of course, cost. In my mind, I think cost is one of the things that you think about, but it's not the first thing you should think about. You should think about, what is the functionality I'm going to gain out of this? Is it going to be beneficial? And there's more than just dollar value. There's the TCO, like I said earlier. It's about, how much time am I saving? Is it helping me with my job? Is it actually, increasing my efficiency all around? And then there's also obviously the dollar value at the end of the day, but all of it coming together and having a smaller footprint is easier to get in than it is to pull it in as a huge deal throughout your organization.
Yeah, for sure. I think both of you touched on some good points there that even brought it all the way back to kind of what we started talking about, right? Where if you can actually demonstrate the value quickly, right? And talk about that value optimization rather than just like cost cutting, right? And then, yeah, so like really how you can realize that value to prove what it actually can do and being able to do that in kind of like a sandbox, like Sumi, you mentioned, of not having to jump through a ton of hoops just to realize some sort of value quickly, right? Just because it might turn out that, well, the thing actually doesn't provide value even when you've gone through this year-long enterprise adoption cycle that Brock mentioned, right? Because it's just really complex once you talk enterprise-wide. Cool. Well, glad that kind of brought it full circle here at the end. So I think we've run out of time here, but really want to thank both of you, Brock and Sumya, for participating in the panel and for the folks who've been asking questions. So definitely thank you guys, and hopefully see you later.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.